Although there has been a recent tick upward in marriages, they have been declining for several years. What are some of the reasons for these declines? There is a generational gap here in perception as part of the problem based on the benefits of marriage. Somehow we're not getting the ideas of the benefits of marriage down to the younger generation. And of course, what is the role of religion? As religion steeply declines in the United States and in the West, marriage seems to go right along with that. What are the messages to teenagers and young adults that we need to be giving about marriage? Why is it so important? Why not push it off? Because that's what's happening. Or an overall choice for careerism, for example. And lastly, AI companions. These are a real threat. It's already happening. And they're a threat to our own individual spirituality. And of course, a threat to marriage. In this episode, I bring on Brian Willoughby, an associate professor in the School of Family Life at Brigham Young University, to discuss his research on these issues. Now, this episode is brought to you by Go and Do Travel and the Wavemakers Podcaster Cruise. We are very excited about this. It's coming up in November on the 15th to the 22nd, going down the Mexican Baja. We'll be bringing the online community face-to-face with the content creators, listening to several presentations, and having a fantastic time. Go to cwicmedia.com, cwicmedia.com. At the top, it's trips and events. Scroll down to Wavemakers and find out more. Here we go. So marriage rates have dropped by nearly 41% in the U.S. since 1970. Can you walk us through what the reasons are behind such a sharp decline?
Yeah, there's really kind of two big things that happen kind of sequentially. The first thing, kind of going back to the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, that really started to shift and really started to change things is that marriage used to be kind of the norm. It's basically what everybody did. Not that every single person got married, but there's this very strong cultural norm once you got to your 20s that this is what you were expected to do. Marriage was kind of this necessity to adulthood. It was kind of this expectation of if you're going to be a functional adult, you're going to be married and start a family. Once we get past the 70s and all the kind of anti-establishment things that happen in the United States and other places, marriage was viewed much more as kind of an optional thing. And once it got viewed as an optional thing, what particularly young adults started to do is they started to delay it and push it back. And so we didn't necessarily see a huge decline yet in the marriage rate, but it did start to go down. What we really started to see was a delay, people pushing marriage back. The average age of first marriage back in the 60s was around 21 to 23, 24, early 20s, and went all the way to the late 20s in just about one or two generations as that kind of social norm started to go away. And then the other big change has been more recent in the last 20 years. And that change has been really shifting from viewing marriage not as a necessity or something that you would delay, but something that might actually get in the way of your life. It's been a relatively recent development where more and more young adults now view marriage as what I and my colleagues call a transition of loss, which means it's something that you lose. You lose freedom. You might lose financial well-being in the view of some young adults. And so once kind of those two things happen, where marriage was no longer needed, you could delay it, and then marriage was something that could potentially, for the view of a lot of young adults, harm me in some ways or make me lose things, marriage became a lot less appealing. And because it was something that I didn't need to do anymore, that's where we've seen kind of this exodus away from marriage, and we've seen that rate really decline.
So what is the cause of that, though? I mean, you go back and you talk about the delay of marriage going into the, say, 70s, 80s, 90s, and then maybe a complete cultural shift in viewing marriage after that in the last 20 years. What is the cause of that? Yeah. You know, is it more people going to college? Is it a tougher time getting jobs? I would say today there are economic issues, certainly, that I didn't have. When I got married, I had more opportunity. I think there were more job options available at the time. But what would you attribute that to?
Yeah, I think it started with a lot of those things. It started kind of benign with just a lot of shifts in what young adulthood was looking like. Like you said, more and more people in the 90s and 2000s were going to post-secondary education. They were going to trade schools, going to university. Kind of our economy in the United States and other places around the world kind of necessitated that. You kind of needed a college degree or a trade degree of some sort to get what a lot of young adults kind of viewed as a good, stable job. And because of that, marriage kind of just naturally started to get delayed because young adults were worried about their finances. They were worried about college. One of the big changes actually related to both those things is that 20 or so years ago, there was a big shift in financial independence of young adults. Most people in their 20s, 30, 40, 50 years ago were financially independent. And then all of a sudden, because of some of these economic factors, most people in their early to mid 20s were still relying on their parents financially. And so they thought to themselves, like, I can't support a family. I can't get married. I can't even support myself. So I think that's where a lot of this started. Again, more recently, I think there's something else that's starting to happen. It's those economic factors are still there, but now there's much more of a choice that's coming along for young adults and teens where they're actively saying, I don't want to get married. What's interesting is 15 years ago when I was studying this, I would talk about what I call the marriage paradox, which is most young adults at the time would say, I really, really want to get married, just not right now. I'm nervous. I don't feel like I'm ready. There was this kind of gap between what they were saying and what they were doing. But now more recently, we're starting to see a shift where more and more teens, young adults are saying, you know what? I might get married. If it happens, great. But I'm not sure I want to anymore. And that's been more of a psychological shift.
Now, is that because of what would the cultural shift there be? I mean, we've talked about economics, we've talked about college, et cetera. But what you're talking about seems to be a view. It's not just something hindering them as far as an obstacle in their way, but it's something that they view as being not as big of an opportunity. It's not as high of a value, so to speak, than they may have for independence or wealth or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors. I'll talk about some of the bigger ones that I think are happening, particularly for our young adults and teens. I think some of this is generational. And what I mean by that is that I hear all the time that young adults and teens are getting strong messages from their parents, or even just watching their parents in marriages that they see is less optimal, not ideal, unhappy. And they're getting kind of both verbal and indirect messages from their parents of maybe marriage isn't the best type of relationship. I hear that a lot from my college students is parents that are incentivizing their kids to not get married, talking about delaying marriage, kind of giving these very negative messages around marriage that I think is a part of it. I think another huge part goes into a much larger cultural discussion happening in my field right now with teens and young adults, which is about digital experiences in digital worlds. And I think when it comes to relationships, we talk a lot about social media and smartphones and the effect that has on kids in terms of mental health and anxiety. But I also think a huge effect that it's starting to have is in these relational spaces between pornography, AI companions, social media. All of those things create a lot of interesting mindsets when it comes to relationships. And where a lot of those things intersect is more and more people, as they get to their 20s, have been so used to relationships being customized, on demand. I view, whether it's pornography or media or other things that are constantly giving me everything that I want when I want it. And they want relationships to be the same way. It's what I call on-demand relationships, right? This idea that when I start dating someone, I want to be a perfect partner where I don't have to compromise anything. They don't get in my way. They don't get in my way with education, career, hobbies. And those of us that have been married know that's not how real relationships work. And so I think a lot of those online spaces are another big contributing factor for some of our younger youth that are kind of having more negative attitudes about dating and relationships because of some of those digital alternatives that have really changed how they think about relationships.
Now that seems to trickle down all the way down to teenagers, because there's a massive decline in the number of teenagers who have even dated by the time they have graduated high school. Would you apply the same thought process with them in terms of, hey, here's social media. I've got an iPhone. This is completely different. I mean, Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about this in terms of mental well-being, but also on the dating side of things. Has this pulled away a desire for dating? I mean, are you getting enough feedback and enough digital relationships that it compensates for a desire to have a personal relationship?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And particularly when you talk about teens, again, we're having a mental health crisis with our teenage population and young adult population because of things like smartphones and social media. They're dealing with a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear about a lot of things in their life. And so I hear a lot from teenagers that relationships feel scary. They feel stressful and they don't want more stress in their life. They're saying, I'm already feeling all this anxiety in my personal life, in school, with my friendships. I don't have the coping mechanisms that we did want, in previous generations sometimes. And so for many of them, the easiest thing to cut out of their life is dating, because dating is stressful. You have to negotiate with another person. There's an acceptance aspect of dating that's very big for teenagers, because once I put myself out there in a romantic setting, I could be rejected. And when I'm already struggling in my life with acceptance and rejection and anxiety and mental health, why would I voluntarily, and that's how they oftentimes view it. So why would I voluntarily put myself in a situation where I could feel worse than I already am? And so I think that is a big, piece to what's happening, because then that trickles into young adulthood. And oftentimes what I see in young adulthood is people in their early 20s trying to flip this switch, say, okay, I've tried to ignore dating for my entire life so far. I'm going to flip this switch when I'm 22 and magically quickly find someone that I'm compatible with. And what they find out is, dating's hard and it's a struggle. And now what happened is I didn't get the skills that previous generations got by being rejected when I was 16, 17. I haven't figured out how to navigate that. And so now not only am I trying to learn a new skill, I'm trying to do it in a much harder context in young adulthood where there's even more responsibilities and stress.
Now, you mentioned parents that have given a negative view or implications of negativity for marriage to their marriage aged kids, right? I mean, those that are maybe in their 20s. Does that also apply to dating? Are the parents also speaking to their teenagers saying, look, just hold off. You don't really need to date? Yeah.
My sense is that's more of an implicit message. There's a disconnect parents have sometimes. I ask in my classes a lot, how many of your parents have incentivized you in some way to delay or put off marriage? And it's about half of my students, and even larger percent of my female students in particular. And a lot of that, I think, from parents is pretty well-meaning. They're worried about particularly their daughters getting married, dropping out of school. What happens if it doesn't work out? If you end up with a divorce, can you support yourself? There's a lot of kind of well-intended fear from parents too. And oftentimes I don't think parents necessarily equate that to dating. They aren't necessarily putting restrictions or incentivizing, hey, don't date. They're just not saying anything. And so I think a lot of young adults get that more implicit message and say, okay, if my parents are so negative about marriage, and particularly if I'm in a college environment where, if I actually go on a date, that would imply I have some inclination or some desire for a long-term committed relationship, well, maybe I don't want to do that either. Because really the message I'm getting from my parents is have fun, figure yourself out, and focus on yourself. And as soon as I date, I have to focus on another person. So even though I don't think parents are oftentimes explicitly saying don't date, I think a lot of times young adults get that message implicitly.
Applying this to the church, when I was dating as a teenager, there was still the rule, and I think it's still going today. There was this idea of, well, do group dates, right? Only group dates. You go out on group dates, don't go out one-on-one. It may not be appropriate. You can get into trouble, a number of different things. My parents never supported that. I would date individually, consistently, and it was really good for me, right? It was important for me to understand, how do I treat a girl? How do I go out one-on-one? I can't rely on my buddies. I can't rely on a group where I can spread the responsibility of conversation and everything else. I had to do it on my own. And then when my kids who are all adults now, were growing up, we did the same thing. It's like, we have our own guidelines, that we have the kids follow when they date. But I always thought one-on-one dating was important. And that's what we would always hear from them in high school and in college. Well, Dad, not very many people date anymore, right? They're not dating anymore. What we do is we hang out. It's a group of people, and we just hang out all the time. Does that play into things?
Yeah, I mean, you've got the famous Elder Oaks at the time talk about encouraging young adults to not hang out and to actually date. And even now, in adolescent populations, they'll talk a lot more about talking. We're talking to each other. It's interesting because date has almost become this negative word. It's not just an old-fashioned word for a lot of teenagers. It's really this word that, like I said, has this kind of negative connotation. Like, I can't have fun. I can't hang out with my friends. It's way too serious. Because they have a lot of fear and anxiety about that. You get this really weird, ambiguous thing right now with adolescents and a lot of young adults as well, where oftentimes people are kind of confused about what they are, because people don't stop having romantic feelings towards each other. Those feelings are still there. No matter what we're doing culturally, they're still going to be there. But there's, like I said, I think a lot more ambiguity that's happening, because, like you said, I hear it from my kids too, who are teenagers and young adults, that the ones that have attempted to go find dates have a hard time, outside of school dances or more formal situations, because there's this immediate resistance to, you want to go on a date with me? I don't know if I want to do that. I'll hang out with you. We'll talk. We'll, kind of do other things. But as soon as you label it and kind of put it in this more formalized setting, there's a lot of resistance to that because of the negative connotations it has.
So, is there a messaging problem? Then you talk about the parents, but is there a cultural messaging problem for young adults and for teenagers then? Because, I'm going through a number of the things that you've written here, right? You found that married millennials, as an example, report a 16% higher life satisfaction, right? 13% better physical health, 11% more optimism, right? Can you elaborate on why marriage continues to yield this kind of outcome, and yet marriages are declining in number? Because if they're looking at it as, well, this is a problem, I'm afraid of sacrifice, I'm afraid of getting rejected, is the message of the return on investment here not strong enough?
100%. I think that's a big thing. And part of it is that oftentimes parents don't realize the counter message that our youth are getting. I mean, to the benefits, like you just said, that book that you're referencing that I wrote on millennial couples, the reason I wrote that book is because in my field, there's a very famous book that came out in 2000 called The Case for Marriage. And it laid out in great detail all the social science evidence we had at the time that showed that marriage was beneficial. Married couples were happier, they were wealthier, they lived longer. And as I was getting all this research from young adults in the research that I was doing, saying all these fears and anxieties and worries, I had this question of, for millennials, in their late 20s, early 30s at the time, were they even seeing the benefits of marriage? They kept telling me they were worried, they were stressed, they thought that marriage wasn't what it used to be, that it didn't help them. So I really wanted to see if marriage still benefited people. And like you said, with some of those numbers, that's what I found. Almost universally, in their early 30s, the couples that were married compared to dating couples and millennials that were single had better outcomes across everything that I looked at: mental health, risk-taking behavior, financial well-being, physical health. They were still better. Marriage still has all these benefits. But to your point, I don't think we talk about them very often. It's not the message that young adults get. They don't see oftentimes the benefits that a strong, stable marriage comes, because unfortunately, sometimes they're boring. They're not the things that are going to get our attention in media, particularly in social media. And even the more romanticized versions of romantic relationships are starting to disappear. I love movies, and one of the stats that I oftentimes share with people is that the number of romantic comedies has drastically declined in the last 20 years. And the reason that happens is because we're not interested in them anymore. We used to be worried that we were giving kids this kind of romanticized version of love that was going to make it harder for them to form relationships, which was partially true. But now they're not even getting that oftentimes. And so oftentimes young adults lack these clear role models and messages about the benefits of marriage. And then, like I said, what we oftentimes miss is the counter programming they are getting back to social media, back to pornography, back to these other online environments. What all those things are teaching kids is that instant gratification is where happiness lies. That whether it's reels or other things, their brains are being trained that I want instant gratification in my life. If you think about, our youth in the world that they've grown up in, the entertainment, any movie show they want to watch, they can watch it right away. Any food that I want, I can call. Anywhere I want to get, I don't have a car, I've got Uber. I can get all these different aspects of our life that make life easier. These young adults that have been raised in this world, everything in their life is instantly available. It goes back to that on-demand piece. And so not only am I not getting the messages about how long-term, committed, hard relationships will eventually benefit me in my life, they're things that take work, take decades of time, take sacrifice. I don't want that. I want things that can help me today, next week, next month. And so it's harder and harder for teens and young adults to put themselves in a position at 40, 50, 60 and say, hey, any of us with kids kind of know how this goes, right? Try to have a conversation with a 19-year-old and say, but think about when you're 50, whether it's about investing or dating. It's harder and harder to have those conversations.
Now, critics sometimes argue that the benefits that we're speaking of here are due to selection effects, right? How does your data control for that? And explain selection effects.
Yeah, so selection effects are basically the idea that we see these kind of benefits because only certain people tend to get married. So for example, education is a big one, right? Because people that go to college, have higher education, are more likely to get married. So maybe the reason they see these benefits are because they're more educated and have higher incomes. And marriage is what we call a spurious variable. It just happens to be there. And so if you look at it, you'll see the benefits. And in social sciences, we've got a very easy way to address that. It's never going to completely take that out of the equation. But we essentially control for it in all the things that we do. We control for things like religiosity, because religious people are also more likely to get married and have positive benefits in their life. We control for education, for income. So, for example, in that book that I wrote, all those comparisons that I made, we're controlling for a large segment of background, economic, financial, educational factors. And then we look to see, once we control for all those things out, do we still see something there statistically, which we still do. It tends to lower the benefit, but it's still there. And so we're pretty confident that there is a marriage benefit, even when we factor all those things out.
So moving to kids here, you said marriage is the bedrock for child development. What recent data best demonstrates how married parent households affect child health and well-being?
Yeah. Well, the big factor with this is stability. We know a lot about child development and child well-being and all the factors that lead to healthy development, whether it's physical, emotional, psychological health. And the strongest predictor of all those things is stability in a child's life. When a child has stability, which means that they can count on the people around them, things don't drastically change that much in their life, that tends to be the best predictor of child outcomes. And so where marriage comes into the picture is that marriages are just significantly more stabilizing in a child's life than any other form of relationship. Single parents, cohabiting parents, cohabiting parents tend to break up at much higher rates than marriages. Single parents tend to move around, have other economic disadvantages, much more than married parents that oftentimes have not just emotional support, but financial support from a partner. And so marriage just provides a stable foundation for kids. That's a big factor. Another factor, and this goes back to some research I did with my advisor, Dr. William Doherty at the University of Minnesota. We were also finding that there's a gendered piece to this too. That when kids are raised with strong male and female role models, both boys and girls benefit from Boys benefit from being socialized by a strong woman in the home. Women benefit by having a strong male role model in the home. And so as soon as you lose one of those pieces, there's some risk involved. So marriage, I think, is also bringing a really strong socializing agent into a child's life that also really helps them have a greater likelihood of success later on.
Well, there was a study that was done in Norway during COVID saying that married households there in Norway fared better than others. How does that finding scale to other national and cultural contexts? Why does that matter?
I think that Norway study actually matters a lot simply because of the cultural setting it happened in. Kind of back to what you were saying about selection effects is one of the things in the United States that oftentimes gets thrown into this conversation is that we know that single parents and even cohabiting parents are kind of culturally disadvantaged a lot in the United States. So a lot of our cultural structures are meant to support married and stable families. And so it can be harder sometimes if you're not a married couple to have social support, for example. But in Norway, in a lot of those Scandinavian countries, those are countries where in particular cohabiting, two couples that live together romantically but don't ever legally get married, is extremely culturally accepted. There's almost no stigma. There's none of the shacking up mentality. And those cohabiting couples oftentimes then look very similar to married couples because there's so much cultural acceptance. So the fact that in Norway, with a culture that's so accepting of other types of relationships, can still find some of these benefits of marriage, again, just speaks to me of the power of that relationship, that almost no matter what you say and whatever the setting is, marriage is kind of the cream that rises to the top of relationships and families. There's just all these types of studies like this that show us that there are benefits, and sometimes we don't even realize. We didn't have studies on pandemics before COVID, but lo and behold, we start to get some of the COVID studies out, and they show that, by the way, marriage was a great resource for people during the pandemic.
I want to back up again, back to the role models, the male and the female. Is there any difference between both on the male side and the female side in terms of dedication to work? So, for example, for a father that is very career driven or not very career driven, or a father that is making at least a median income or above and providing benefits, et cetera, that go along perhaps with a job, to all the way down to unemployment. And then on the other side, for a woman who is either in the home or is working part-time or continuing through the spectrum, working at a good job or even highly driven in a career, are there differences in those levels of employment and engagement in their work? And does it vary by gender?
Yeah, so there's kind of two factors there that all parents have to kind of find a way to balance that ties into the research on this. One is income. Financial resources do matter to kids and to the well-being of a family. Doing a lot of things as a family takes resources. Family vacations, for example, are great, and not that your vacations have to be lavish beach resorts, but even small stuff, going camping, costs some money. Putting your kids in extracurricular activities that could be good for them, as long as you're not overdoing it, costs money, particularly in the United States. So financial resources matter. There's a lot of research that says that kind of eventually peters out a little bit. There's a ceiling effect. But certainly, like you said, is for both men and women, being driven and working and bringing in financial resources to a family matters. Now, what parents have to balance that with is time. Because the other thing we know really matters for kids of all ages, all the way up to young adults, is time. The more time parents spend with their kids, the better. The more open conversations, the more role modeling, the more support you can show them, the better. And that goes for dads and moms. Sometimes I'll talk to dads and like, oh yeah, mom's at home. She spends all the time. I can, work my 70, 80-hour week and bring in all the money, and that's great. Research shows that's not awesome for your kids. They need you in the home. They need the dad in the home, like I said, just as much as mom. So parents oftentimes have to balance as they're figuring out their career configurations. How do we balance bringing in enough resources financially to, have a stable home and resources for our family, but also having time. Now, the one gendered caveat to that, to the second part of your question, we also still continue to get a lot of strong research that say for young kids, having mom in the home is really important. Having that mother figure when kids are young, from attachment purposes and other things, there's pretty clear research out there that shows that in particular is really important for kids. Not that dads aren't important. Dads are important when kids are young too. But there is kind of a critical period where it seems like mom is of particular importance.
Now, moving on to technology here, we've got a lot of technological advances that are oftentimes liberating. They're oftentimes focused on convenience. Going back all the way to things that would help a woman in the home with domestic duties, so to speak, that now liberate her, give her more time, more freedom, more options in her life, right? All great things, right? And then you move on and you go to what I think is the biggest ever technological change to culture, and that is the pill, coming in late 50s, early 60s. And this is where we start seeing a massive difference in the decrease in marriage numbers starting in this 1970. And then you move on to social media and the iPhone, right? The iPhone and social media really starts taking off around 2012. And now we've got AI companions. And this is something that Elder Bednar, for example, spoke on not too long ago in talking about the danger of this. I kind of thought at the time I actually did an episode on that, but I just thought, okay, I'll listen to him, see what he has to say. But this is something that is growing and could be a problem. You've got data here that says that 1 in 3 young men and 1 in 4 young women have chatted with an AI romantic companion. Now, what does this say about their views on real relationships?
Yeah, I think, and by the way, I just did another big data collection that's just wrapping up right now, just because I want to verify those numbers, and the numbers got worse, not better.
Great. Yeah.
But I think it ties into all these things, right? Is what isn't going away for any of us, and including our kids, is the desire for emotional connection and just connection in general. It's a basic human need that's never going to go anywhere. So even as we've talked about how marriage and dating has changed and is maybe more young adults are moving away from it, the need to connect is still there. And so what I think you're seeing with these AI companion numbers is the early indicators of a shift towards what I'll call heavy experimentation with finding that connection through AI. Because what we're seeing is that there certainly already is a portion of our teenagers and young adults who are using AI romantic companions compulsively. That's already a thing that we're starting to see. I think the numbers are higher than most people realize. But for a vast majority of young adults, I think we're still in that experimentation phase. They're dabbling with it. They're seeing how it goes. But what the early indications are also telling us is that the response from them is very positive. And that's a hard thing, I think, sometimes for older adults that I talk to about this to understand. Why would a teenager or a young adult, why would they engage with a romantic AI? Like, what would be the appeal of that? And what they forget sometimes is that these teenagers and young adults, they interact with most people in their life electronically. They're texting their friends, they're DMing their friends, they're on social media. That's how they communicate with most people in their life. And these generative AIs mimic that. And they do a very good job of doing it. They've been specifically designed to trigger emotional connection. There's some fascinating social psychology research that's starting to come out that shows that when someone engages with one of these romantic AI companions, they form very quick emotional bonds because that's what they're trained to do. They know all the science we have about validation and emotional connection, and that's all they're doing. But they're doing it in a very one-sided way. So if we kind of circle back to some of the early things in the conversation, if I'm a young adult and I want connection, I desire connection just as a human, but I'm scared to death of other people, I don't have the skills to date, or I'm worried about dating, or every time I do it, I'm dealing with these people that require me to sacrifice and compromise with them. And so I jump on ChatGPT, or I jump on Replica, or I jump on a companion app, and I just try it out. And what I find there is someone who is always taking my side, who is always making me feel better, and I never have to compromise with them.
Affirmation, yeah.
And so you can see how appealing that would be. And if I'm just experimenting with it, I think we're going to see more and more young adults that get in deep with it before they even realize it's happened.
Now, another big concern with AI is it's kind of taking pornography to the next level. And you've got pornography, which is also already just a huge poison for society. And putting that, you've got one study here that shows that 53% of respondents have viewed AI-generated sexual images, right? How might this change future expectations for a real sexual relationship with a spouse?
Yeah, I mean, we already know that that's one of the major negative effects of pornography use is changing expectations about intimacy, that what kids are viewing with pornography is not showing them what healthy sexual relationships look like. And we know that for most of our youth now, not only is pornography their first sexual experience, it's their main sexual educator by the time they have a real partner. And so what the AI component is doing, it's simply exaggerating a lot of those negative effects because it feeds back into that personalization. That online pornography today is already vastly different than it was 20, 30 years ago because of just the volume of it. There's so much volume of it on these pornographic websites that it's very easy for me as a teenager or young adult to go find whatever I'm looking for. I'm go find thousands of videos for whatever I'm looking for. But what AI is going to add to that is now I don't have to look for it. It's just going to be given to me. It's going to learn what I want, and it's going to feed it back to me on this constant.
Powerful. That's tough. So, that is so tough.
Yeah. So that personalization, that customization of relationships, I think is just going to get stronger. And then I think there's a whole nother concern I have about the AI piece when it comes to sexual content, which is the role-playing piece. I recently presented to a group of professionals that deal with sex offending youth. And I shared with them some of the data we have on some of these apps that allow youth and young adults to role play any situations that they want. And because they're AI, there's no regulation on them in the United States or elsewhere, which means that if I'm a youth that's at risk for sex offending, I can go on to one of these AI apps and I can play out any dark fantasy that I want, and it will play along with me for as long as I want. And there's some, I think, real danger for some of that too, that, like I said, has very little regulation right now.
What about the mental health through AI? You've got over 60% of women and over 50% of men using AI relationship apps report risk of depression and high loneliness. Is there a cause and effect here? Do you have the same individuals that would already have that higher level of anxiety and depression? Are they going to be more drawn than others to an AI companion? Or does the AI companion and working in a digital relationship outside of reality cause the anxiety and the depression?
Yeah, I think you've got some of both going on. Certainly people that are struggling with depression and loneliness are going to be more drawn to AI companions. And so I think you've got some of that happening. And then that AI companion is oftentimes just going to probably exaggerate a lot of the symptoms that they're struggling with. But I also think you'll get other people that generally are doing fine and functioning well and just aren't really engaging in human relationships. And like I said, are experimenting with AI that find themselves kind of caught in this trap. And I do think we'll eventually find that there is a risk to someone's mental health because, as a relationship expert, this is essentially empty calories. And what I mean by that is it's like candy. I'm getting that instant gratification, but I don't have to put anything into it. And so I'm not really working my relationship muscles. And so eventually I think most people will find that it's a pretty hollow relationship. It's a very one-sided relationship. I don't really get anything. And whether I figured that out at 19, 30, 35, 40, I think you'll see that component start to happen as well, where people said, hey, I've really, really gone into a deep dive of engagement with an AI companion for the last 5 years. And suddenly I had that moment where I realized, man, I'm really lonely. I'm really struggling with things. I've realized this isn't a real person. I realized this is hollow. We don't have that research yet because it's so new, but I think we'll probably be getting it in the next couple of years.
Yeah, you've got another study here, which is odd to me, but it says 42% of users say AI is easier to talk to than people. It seems to me like that would be 100%, but and then 43% say it listens better. And I think that would be 100% too. And it's, I don't know. I think beyond just the idea of dating, it's those that are already in a relationship, those that are already married. I mean, if they're starting to explore and go out into getting these AI companions and starting to compare them to their spouse, you're walking into some pretty dangerous territory there. I mean, I try to listen as best I can to my wife. I do what I can. I'm not the perfect at it. I don't think I'm going to be able to compare to an AI companion.
Right. Yeah. In fact, this is a scenario that I share with people just to help them understand kind of where we're at with this technology. You can use the technologies that exist today. If I'm a married person, we've been married for 20, 30 years. I can feed these programs a younger version of my spouse. It will generate pictures for me of that younger version of my spouse, and it can talk to me. So you could essentially cheat on your spouse with a younger version of your spouse right now with the technology that exists today. But you're right. We actually have found that right now that experimentation with AI companions, it's not just single people. People in relationships, married people, seem to be using it just as much as people that aren't in relationships, because like we've talked about, it's a very easy resource to turn to of how to fight with my spouse. They're not willing to listen to me. This companion will listen to me. But then I'm not ever learning to work things out with my spouse.
Yeah. And it's like anything. I mean, I can see us going through the exact same phase as pornography or anything else, where it's kind of like you kind of have a certain group of, say, therapists that are going to say, sure, but you can use this a little bit to help you get through problems with your spouse, right? You can rely on this a little bit to help keep you from just being mad all the time or being disagreeable with your spouse. If you use this a little bit, I mean, you can just see this happening because you get this already in the therapy industry where they're saying, no, pornography can really help out your sex life, or it can really help you out if your wife isn't, say, putting out enough, whatever it is. Yeah. It's like it's going down the same track.
Yeah, and to be clear, I think there are areas of life where these AI systems can be helpful for people. Mediation, for example, in therapy settings, in a very closed, monitored way, assessment help for clinicians. I think there's ways where this technology can be used in positive ways. But like most things, and like you said with pornography, that's not what most people are doing. It was interesting in the more recent study that we did. We asked people, what platforms are you using? And the most common one that people are using for a romantic companion is just ChatGPT right now, which, isn't specifically designed for that, but is an open generative AI platform, language predictive model. It says, okay, if this is what you're looking for, I'll do it.
Yeah. And if you get the pro version on that, because I use this for writing and for outlines for episodes and everything else, it's going to learn you. It's going to learn you quickly, and it's going to do a very good job of it. And then it's going to produce, again, whatever you want to hear, whatever's good for you.
Yep.
And going back to affirmation. Now, this is another thing that I find is fascinating is marriage and religion and how they're coupled. We've always seen this in history. Marriage has always been a religious institution. We get married still in chapels and churches and temples, etc. What does the data show about marriage outcomes for those that are highly religious as compared to those that are non-religious over time?
Yeah, kind of like marriage has this kind of very robust positive effect that we talked about. Religion is kind of the same way. Religion tends to be a very positive benefit in people's life when it comes to outcomes. And in particular, some of my colleagues have really been looking into this in the last 5 years. They found that in-home worship is in particular really powerful. So being very religious and engaging in in-home religious practices, reading religious texts in the home, praying in the home. When people do that, they tend to have just positive benefits in their life in general. So when you kind of, I guess I'll use a pun, marry those things, right? Where now we're married and we're religious, you tend to oftentimes get the most positive outcomes we see. It's generally what we see is that married religious couples tend to have just about the most positive on average outcomes in their relationship, in their families, with their kids. Certainly there's exceptions to that, but on average, that's what we see. And one of the big reasons for that is a term that we call sanctification, which is that religious people tend to put divine significance to things in their life. And so when you pair that with marriage, religious people oftentimes think of marriage in a divine way, that marriage isn't just this relationship of convenience. It has holier significance. Obviously in the temple, that's a very clear example of that. And when couples see that and they view their marriage in that way, the big thing it tends to do that leads to a lot of these positive outcomes is it's extremely motivational. I'm much more engaged in putting effort and motivation into my relationship because I view this, we put this in a Latter-day Saint context, in eternity. I'm with this person with eternity. I don't want to be unhappy for eternity. So that's very motivational for me to work out conflicts with my wife and to engage with her, not even adding the benefit of joint prayer, joint temple service together. Those things just create unity in a relationship that make everything else, parenting, et cetera, just a lot easier.
Now you cite the Silverstein study where this is actually really, seems really high to me, but 97% of highly religious men were married by the time they were in their mid 40s versus 65% of non-religious men. Now you've talked a little bit here about some of the attributes of religiosity and how that might change and strengthen marriage. But I looked right now today at men that are in their 20s and their 30s. I don't think we're going to end up at 97% marriage. The numbers seem to be so much higher of those that are not married yet, that it would be natural to think that, okay, 97% might be pretty high for what we can expect as a society going into those men turning 40, say 45 years old. What going along with that, religion is decreasing quite a bit in the West. And so if your religiosity is dropping, we already have a drop in marriage. Having a drop in religiosity, isn't that going to add to a drop in marriage as well? Oh, yeah.
In fact, this is where I start talking to some of my students about marriage. The word I start using is endangered species. There's a graph I like to show people when I start to talk about some of these trends in the intersection with religiosity. It's just the sheer number of marriages in the United States, not the marriage rate, just the number of marriages in the United States. And typically those kind of graphs, the reason we don't use those kind of raw numbers in demographic charts is because of population increase. It just tends to go up no matter what happens. It might go up less or more, but it tends to go up. That graph with marriages plateaued in the early 2000s and has been decreasing ever since. And so marriage is truly starting to not just be less and less popular, it's starting to go away. And a lot of that, like you said, is the lack of religious affiliation and religiosity, because that ties back to what we said earlier about norms. As people get less religious, as marriage is a relationship of choice, oftentimes it's our religious institutions today that are kind of the last bastion of push towards any form of institutional marriage, meaning that, hey, this is kind of expected. It's kind of what you're supposed to do. And so as more and more people disengage from religious institutions, they're getting put into this larger secular culture where marriage is kind of very much pushed into the back burner. And the other piece to that is what we're getting now, particularly in young adulthood, is more and more young adults that are professing religiosity. They're saying I'm religious. They're saying I have this affiliation with faith. But back to in-home worship, when you actually look at how they engage with their faith, you look at how they approach their faith, they're coming at it from a very individualized perspective, meaning they're approaching their religion saying, I'm part of this religious group, but I'm only going to take this 30% that I like. I'm going to exercise the other 70%. And so now what's happening is you get more and more young adults that are saying they're religious, but oftentimes one of the key things they're exercising is the religious or the marriage and dating norms, and saying, for example, in the church, I'm a Latter-day Saint, and I have a testimony of that, and I go to church every Sunday, but I really don't like when the prophets encourage us to get married. It kind of rubs me the wrong way when they make such a big deal about marriage being such an important thing. I'm not sure how I feel about the fact that you have to be married to get into the celestial kingdom. So you get this kind of, it's what one of my colleagues coined congregations of one, where they're kind of creating their own individualized version of their religion. That I think is just another thing that pushes dating and marriage on the back burner.
You said marriage it fundamentally changes who we are. I fully agree with that, right? And it does it through sacrifice, right? You've got to stretch yourself. You in the immediate now, you have issues like a spouse checking you on certain things, right? But what people don't realize, if they haven't gone through that, is that yes, you go through that, but it is for your benefit, typically. I'm not saying in every situation, and there's extremes and things that don't work out well, but for the most part, as far as your personality, the less selfish you are, the better human being you are. And nothing does that better as kind of a lab for charity, right, than family does. Now, this is something that is still taught, I would say, reduced, even in the church, but in religion more broadly, it's still taught in that regard. Is this message at all resonating or even produced outside of religion?
I think in certain ways, I think there's still a general sense in Western culture, even with as much as we embrace individualism, of kind of a broad moral ethical code. But I think oftentimes people struggle outside of religious settings because that idea of being a good person is immediately counterbalanced with, but don't judge anyone for what they think is the right thing. And so I think a lot of young adults and adults have to kind of grapple with this idea of, okay, we still believe in these kind of moral absolutes about murder, and kidnapping, and, kindness and generosity, these kind of, Aristotle type virtues. But we also very much live in a culture that is one of the worst things you could do is be judgmental or say that there is absolute truth, because as soon as you say there's absolute truth, then there is wrong in the world, and things become less relative. So I think there's a lot of struggle with that. And I think even, like I was saying, within religious circles, that's a struggle as well. And like you said, tying it back to marriage is in messaging is I think it's hard to resonate some of these messages, because in some ways it almost feels like a fantasy to a lot of young adults that this relationship that's going to be hard and is going to require sacrifice and heartache and is inherently risky, because at any moment my spouse could decide to leave. That experience could help me at a fundamental level, like you said, be a better person. One of my favorite graphs that I show people sometimes in marriage classes is it's a graph about generosity. And specifically the generosity towards a person, and it was called marital virtue, that kind of develops in a relationship. And it's a study that showed that when couples go through hardship and trials, losing a child, losing a job, whatever it might be, when they have developed this sense of generosity towards their spouse, their life satisfaction actually went up when they went through a trial. And people that lacked that or were single didn't get that benefit. And that's a hard thing to get people to say, hey, by the way, being married in a strong, stable marriage, what it's fundamentally going to do to you is that when you go through something hard in your life, it's going to actually allow, if we want to put this in gospel language, it's going to allow the refinement to actually take place. It's going to help you refine yourself in a way, because you have to navigate that with another person, that sometimes is a lot harder when you're just trying to do it by yourself. But that seems so abstract, and oftentimes you're talking about the future, and you're talking to young adults that, like I said, are already so averse to trial and adversity in the first place. It's like, okay, so you're telling me that the main pitch you have to marriage is that when I go through hard things, it's going to be easier. I'm trying to avoid the hard things completely as it is. I don't want anything to do with the hard things. So I'm going to try to stay in the single lane over here where my primary goal is to avoid all possible hardship if I can.
Which is just going to make hardship harder for you, right? There's no resilience that's built up in that case at all. There's nothing. It's like putting you in the plastic box your whole life and never being exposed to any kind of a bacteria or anything. It's your emotional and spiritual immune system is useless.
Right. Yeah.
In that type of a scenario. So that's concerning. That's really concerning. Now, you have called and are an advocate for pro-family policies being put into place. I've thought about this. I've brought up things before on the show on these types of things. The big, beautiful bill, all of it's good and bad in there. One of them, I think, is I don't know, it's something small, a $200 or a $500 tax credit. I can't remember what it was per child. But what type of policies can be put in place to help support growth in families?
Yeah. I think there's obviously two big ones, and I'm not a financial policy expert, so I'm not going to even pretend to propose any specific legislation. But I think the principles are we have to, at the least, not punish people for getting married and having kids. I think I don't think that's a good level to be at, but that's a base level to get at. Whether it's tax rebates, whether it's other things, is as soon as people look at getting married and having kids as a net loss, that's a problem. I think we can do better than that. I think that governments can and should look for ways to incentivize families. And I always want to be careful with this because I don't think financial incentive, I'm using the word incentive broadly, because I'm not sure financial incentives are the best or only way to go. In fact, we can just look at Europe, many Asian countries that are going through a fertility crisis right now. They've primarily tried to use financial incentives to deal with that, and they've been complete failures.
Hungary has really pushed this, and it hasn't done very well.
Yeah, because people look at it and say, well, you can give me, a couple $1,000s to have a kid, but that doesn't give me my time back. And so I think it goes beyond just financial incentives, and we have to think more structurally. Back to something I said earlier about time with kids. Do we have policies in place? And this doesn't have to be federal policy or even state policy. This could be corporate policy. Do we have policies in place that help people spend time with their families and kids, mom and dads alike? Those could be leave policies. Those could be work-family balance things. I think we can think more broadly about creating spaces for people to prioritize their family over other things that they might need in their life. And part of that can be financial, part of that can be time incentives. I think another huge policy thing that's completely lacking is educational. And I know as soon as we talk about education, we get into some controversial territory of I don't want the government to tell me what I should be teaching my kids about marriage or relationships. But I always find it fascinating. We spend so much time teaching our teenagers, financial literacy, how to drive a car. We have driver's ed, and we teach them nothing about interpersonal skills. So I'm not talking about relational education, about the value of marriage or pro-family things that are going to, have a lot of people fighting it. I'm talking about basic communication skills, conflict resolution skills, maybe a little bit of the benefit of committed relationships in marriage. I think that's something that is completely missing in certainly the United States and most parts of the world. That can be another thing we can look at in terms of policies that can start to, again, even if it's not mandated, incentivizing states, incentivizing counties to say, hey, if you put relationship education and offer it, we can provide benefits for you to do that by saying that you want to help people have healthy relationships.
Does the fertility rate bother you?
Yes. It should bother everyone. Again, as I mentioned before, unfortunately in the United States, this is barely getting much attention. It's starting to get some attention. But if you want to see where we're heading, look at Southern Europe, look at Southeast Asia, Japan, South Korea. Look at the crisis that is starting to emerge in those countries, and you'll see where we're probably going to be in 10 or 15 years. I hope we start talking about it more before we get to that point, but it's something that worries me a lot.
Yeah. I've said this, I'm beating a dead horse here to my audience, but it is the number one temporal issue. I believe you can tie it spiritually, but it's just even looking at it temporally. I think it is the number one temporal issue on earth right now. I think it is very, very concerning. But all right, wrapping up here, if you could summarize your research, all your findings, and you're in class speaking to a group of Zoomers, Gen Z, how would you explain things to them, just opening up within like 60 seconds?
Yeah. I think one, you got to help them see real quick, marriage is good for you. Dating is good for you, but then acknowledge that it's scary. The two words I use at the beginning of every class that I teach on this is that confidence and awareness is what is critical for young adults to develop. You have to be aware of what's happening around you, aware of the skills that are needed to have healthy relationships, and then build confidence in yourself to go out and be willing to be rejected. When you do that and you use resources to build those things, then you don't have to worry that much. I think that's the key message is, two religious Latter-day Saints that marry in the temple and have a good education and love each other, their divorce rate it's not zero, but it's pretty close.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to hear, Brian. Really appreciate your time, your expertise, all your research and findings on this. I hope that people really focus more and more on these numbers. The numbers are overwhelmingly solid in terms of teaching us what is going on in the West, especially, and down to the United States, even in Utah, right? In your state, the last numbers show that they were the largest drop in the fertility rate in the entire country. And it's concerning. We need to really take a look at these things, but really appreciate your time. And where can people find you? Where is your book available?
I've got two books, The Marriage Paradox and Millennial Marriage. I believe both are available on Amazon. And I've got a website at BYU. If you just search the School of Family Life and go to the faculty directory, you can find me. It's got all my research listed there.
Awesome. Brian, really appreciate it.
Yeah, great to be on.